campaigns for the highest offices in our country. Mr. President, I would ask the unanimous consent that the balance of my statement be inserted in the record at this time.
Without objection.
And again, I want to thank Senator Whitehouse and his colleagues who have taken the lead in bringing this issue to the attention of the public in such a compelling way that they've had. And I yield the floor.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since the Supreme Court's decision 2 years ago on Citizens United, we've seen a new system of campaign finance emerge. Without limits on donations or limits on spending by outside groups like super PACs, we have been inundated with mostly negative political advertisements while candidates from both sides of the aisle struggle to raise more and more money just to keep up. Nearly $170 million has been spent so far in this election cycle by outside groups, and that doesn't include how much the candidates themselves have spent. Just think what good we could do with that $170 million. The rising influence of donors and corporations is a problem. But the larger issue, and the one that we're here to talk about today, and I want to recognize the leadership of Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who has done such a great job of raising the importance of this issue. The larger issue is the prevalence of secret money that is increasingly making its way into our campaigns. Millions of dollars of untraceable money has already been spent during this election. This spending is just unacceptable because there is too much at stake in this election for Americans who are struggling. And by that, I'm not talking about the secret donors who can afford to spend millions of dollars on secret political ads. I'm talking about middle-class families who are struggling with their mortgages, trying to pay for college, fighting to get their credit card payments mailed in on time. These are the Americans who need our attention, and they deserve to know who paid for the most recent negative ads that they see on their televisions. The truth is that middle-class families will not be able to catch a break unless we start by reducing the influence of special interests, of big donors, and of corporate lobbyists. And that's what the Disclose Act is about, and that's why it deserves our support. We've heard Senator Levin speak very eloquently to the 501c4 organizations, those organizations that are allowed to keep their donors secret, and in many cases they're actually allowed to deduct those contributions. Those secret donors can deduct those contributions from their taxes. It's hard to understand why they should be allowed to do that. It isn't right, it isn't fair, and we need to change the system. Now, some have objected to requiring disclosure of donors because they say it undermines free speech. Let me address that. Because our democracy is based on the free exchange of ideas, and political speech should enjoy the highest level of protection. We should recognize that citizens always have the right to speak and be heard, especially on matters as important as who should represent them in Washington. That's not what the Disclose Act is about. It is precisely because we need to make sure citizens stay involved in the political process that we need this reform. Because freedom of speech does not mean freedom of secrecy. Anonymous political speech by these organizations has no place in our democracy. Accountability, transparency, and credibility must be preserved in our political system. When I talk to voters in New Hampshire these days, they're not optimistic about being heard in Washington. According to the Granite State poll that's done by the University of New Hampshire, 3/4 of our New Hampshire adults think that members of Congress are more interested in serving special interest groups. 1/4 of New Hampshire adults think they have no influence at all on what the federal government does. People throughout New Hampshire and throughout this country don't believe that their interests are being represented. What they do support is the kind of legislation that we're talking about in the Disclose Act. 3/4 of New Hampshire adults strongly support a law that would require corporations, unions, and nonprofit groups to disclose their sources of spending when they participate in elections. And this support isn't limited to New Hampshire. According to a Greenberg-Quinlan poll recently, 77% of voters nationwide, regardless of party, say reforming our campaign finance system is very important. Now, you know, I get a lot of cards and letters from people, and most of the people who write to me and write to all of us sign their names. And because they sign their names, we know who they are, and we can respond, we can correct misunderstandings, we can engage in a discussion with them about policies before the Congress. The same should be true for political speech. Justice Antonin Scalia once wrote, and we put this on poster board because I thought it was so apropos to what we're talking about with the Disclose Act. He said, this is Justice Scalia, that requiring people to stand up in public for their political beliefs for their political acts, fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. It's important for donors to own their participation. That's what this Disclose Act is about, and that's why we should all vote to support it. Now, I can't finish my remarks without talking about a New Hampshire woman who really represents what we're talking about when we talk about participation in the political process. Her name was Doris Haddock, Granny D, as we knew her in New Hampshire. Some people may remember that when she was 89 years old, she started walking across America to call attention to the importance of campaign finance reform. In the 14 months that she took to walk across this country, and she turned 90 on the way, she traveled 3,200 miles. She went through 4 pairs of sneakers, and everywhere she stopped, she talked about the importance of addressing campaign finance reform so that ordinary Americans could be heard. Well, Granny D died 2 years ago at the age of 100. She left behind 2 children, 8 grandchildren, and 16 great-grandchildren. She also left behind an incredible legacy that embodies the importance of what the First Amendment was designed to protect and what it need not protect. We need to make sure that people like Granny D can continue to be heard, regardless of how much money they have. That's why we need the Disclose Act. The First Amendment doesn't protect the rights of shell corporations and dummy organizations to flood our airwaves with negative ads using money from anonymous donors. Let's take a lesson from Granny D. Let's take a stand. Let's pull back the curtains to see who is behind all of this secret money. The Disclose Act will allow us to do that. That's why we should support its passage, and I hope our colleagues from the other side of the aisle will decide they should join us. It's critical to our democratic process. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise this evening in support of the Disclose Act. This is legislation to shine some sunlight onto our elections, to restore transparency and accountability into this nation's political campaigns. The Disclose Act is a responsible step toward making sure that the people decide the course of our future. The people decide the course of our future. That people make their own choices based on good information. That people always have the ability to hold this government accountable through transparency. Now, right now, this is not the case. On January 21st of 2010, the Supreme Court made a decision that gave power to corporations to spend unlimited money on political campaigns with no transparency whatsoever. That includes foreign corporations, by the way. So, for example, it would be pretty easy for a Chinese company to start spending a lot of money to influence America's elections, again, with no transparency whatsoever. The Citizens United decision has already dealt a blow to our democracy. It's allowing a handful of billionaires, corporations, and secretive groups that represent special interests to try and buy votes. That already happened in Montana once, and the people of Montana put a stop to it 100 years ago this year. At the turn of last century, one of the world's wealthiest men literally bought himself a seat to this U.S. Senate. His name? William Clark. He was one of the mining barons of the Gilded Age. Mr. Clark left his mark across this nation. In fact, Clark County, Nevada is named for him. Back then, Montana's legislature got to choose who served in the U.S. Senate, so William Clark paid as many legislators as he could to send him to Washington. In fact, he spent a staggering $431,000 buying his Senate seat in 1899. Now, that's equivalent to about $11 million today. This bold bribery was a national scandal back then, and it shaped Montana forever. Because of what William Clark did, Montana passed a law in 1912 limiting the influence of wealthy corporations over our elections. And just as important, the scandal showed us that as Montanans, transparency prevents corruption. Transparency allows for accountability. Mr. President, transparency in government is a fundamental value in Montana. A few weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Montana's important 1912 law that guarantees transparency and accountability in our elections, citing its own Citizens United decision and the idea that corporations somehow have the same rights as individual people. The U.S. Supreme Court tossed out Montana's century-old law. Now, the secretive special interests are taking full advantage of this uneven playing field. They're buying up millions of dollars of time on the airwaves, blanketing Montana with lies and distortions in order to influence the voters. Now, Montanans are getting sick of it. Like 100 years ago, a few millionaires and billionaires are bankrolling secretive campaign spending, and they're steamrolling our democracy because they're doing it in secret with no accountability and no transparency. I support undoing the Citizens United decision by amending the U.S. Constitution, but that's a heavy lift. But it's one that I, along with many of my colleagues, support. And in the meantime, let's make our elections more transparent. I think I join most Montanans when I say that money spent influencing voters ought to be transparent, no matter where it comes from. And that's exactly what the Disclose Act does. Mr. President, I don't think anyone here has heard complaints about too much transparency when it comes to TV's political ads. The Disclose Act requires any organization or individual who spends $10,000 or more on a political campaign to report that expense within 24 hours. No organization or type of organization is exempt. It applies to super PACs, unions, and so-called issue advocacy organizations. That's not stifling free speech. That's responsibility. It's accountability. The Disclose Act strengthens our freedom to make informed decisions about our democracy. And for folks in Montana, it's a chance for us to put our priorities back ahead of special interests, for Montanans to make their own choices, free from influence of unlimited spending by multinational corporations. And it's what the people of this nation deserve. And I urge all of my colleagues to vote for that transparency. A vote against the Disclose Act is a vote to allow secret special interests to buy something that never should be, ever for sale. Our democracy and the power to make our own decisions with good information, full transparency, and full accountability. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Florida.
Mr. President, before the senator from Montana leaves, I want to ask him a question. Did you hear earlier this evening a senator come out here and say that he thought that the Disclose Act would intimidate people from participating in the political process? The fact of disclosing where the money is coming from is supposed to be an intimidation?
Well, any time the transparency and accountability is intimidation, that's a big problem. That means there's a different agenda behind that money, to be honest with you, the senator from Florida. I would just say that the Disclose Act, I think, is a well-crafted, smart bill that allows transparency and accountability to our elections process. The time when accountability and transparency becomes a bad thing, that we are in big, big trouble in this country. Thank you for the question.
Yes, indeed, and I thank the senator for his comments, and my comments will be very similar because the Disclose Act is a very simple piece of legislation. It's about letting people know who is spending money and how much in order to influence elections, and therefore not to allow the democratic process of electing officials to be taken over by a few super donors who pay for these slash and burn negative ads that are also, by the way, patently false. Mr. President, I've had $8 million of negative attack ads run against me. Every independent fact-checking organization has said they are either false or pants-on-fire false, and yet the public doesn't know where the money's coming from in order to run these kind of ads. I've really never seen this kind of situation that we are facing this year because this 5-4 Supreme Court decision has left the door open for these mega donors to secretly finance and propel the flow of false information. And it's not just happening in my state. We're hearing that it's happening in a bunch of states. And it's not just in Senate elections, it's happening in elections at all levels, including the presidential election. And so what's happening is these people and these organizations are donating so they can satisfy their own agendas, and they do so in their own self-interest to see that it's going to be protected in Washington. Now, the ones that are running ads in my state of Florida clearly don't care about Florida. They care about their own political agenda. And in essence, they're trying to buy elections. And so with this new crop of secretive donors seemingly popping up new ones every day, there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. And that's why we need a law like the Disclose Act. Voters need to know who's influencing the elections. We, as federal candidates, you have to know basically every dime of political contributions. And, oh, by the way, we are limited in the amount of contributions per contributor that we can take, and we can only take from people, not from a corporation. We are obviously seeing how distorted the implementation of this 5-4 Supreme Court decision is in this law, and that's why we've got to pass a bill to at least bring it out into the sunshine. In this Citizens United 5-4 Supreme Court decision, which allows these unlimited donations, the Supreme Court even said in a part of the opinion that there is a need for transparency. Well, that's what we are trying to accomplish with this legislation. The Supreme Court, in its opinion, said that voters should be well informed about the group or the person that is speaking in what they consider free speech. Well, that's exactly what this legislation intends to do. It informs the electorate. It makes sure that they have the information they need to judge the message for themselves. And this onslaught of unlimited, anonymous contributions puts everyday folks at risk of having their voices drowned out by the billionaires and the corporations. And if the campaign law says that the average person has to disclose their contribution to a candidate, well, why shouldn't the billionaires and the millionaires have to do so as well? It's a question of fairness. There shouldn't be two sets of standards for political contributions. And that's why we are here on the Senate floor well into the night supporting the Disclose Act. And we ought to pass this bill. And yet you see partisan politics at its worst when the votes are being recorded. It's simple. It says what has already been described. Anybody, you know, the fellow who wants to donate $100, even $1,000, if they're going through a super PAC, they don't have to disclose that. But if they're donating $10,000 or more, then that ought to be disclosed, and we ought to know where that money is coming from and what is their agenda by virtue of us knowing where the money's coming from. So this legislation will stop the special treatment for the super PACs by making sure that they play by the rules that everybody else has to. Mr. President, there's going to be a lot of commentary here tonight. I thank you for the opportunity, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me, first of all, just thank Senator Whitehouse for heading up this campaign finance task force. I think this has been a real solid effort by a number of senators, and Senator Whitehouse, whether it's at Netroots or here on the Senate floor, has been participating this evening, and we really appreciate all of his help. The presiding officer, Senator Merkley, has also been a key member of the task force. Senator Bennett, who is going to be speaking after me, another member of the task force, and we so appreciate all of us getting together. And one of the things we need to be reminded of this evening is where we are. We just took a vote to try to get on to the Disclose Act bill. And 51 Democrats said, let's get on to the bill, and 44 Republicans. Not a single Republican voted to allow us to get on the bill. And basically what we're in the Senate, as Senator Bennett and Senator Whitehouse and Senator Merkley know, we're in the mode of a full filibuster now. We're on a motion to proceed. We're not allowed to get onto the bill. And so people should just recognize that's the posture we're in right now, and yet we're going to be down here. We're going to be talking about this issue. And I join my colleagues today to talk about this serious problem of campaign finance reform, one that threatens the very nature of our democracy. And that threat is the unprecedented flow of money into our elections. We need to look at this dangerous torrent of money and consider how to stop it. And I believe a step in the right direction is the Disclose Act. In January 2010, the Supreme Court issued its disastrous opinion in Citizens United versus FEC. 2 months later, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals decided Speech Now versus FEC, which the Supreme Court upheld. These two cases gave rise to super PACs. They opened the floodgates of secret cash. Super PACs have poured millions of dollars into negative and misleading campaign ads, and they often do so under the cover of darkness. Quiet, stealthy, without disclosing the true source of the donations. It's ironic. They make all this sound and fury on the airways, but they are silent on who is paying for it. Why? Why the silence? Why the cat and mouse? The American people are blessed with common sense. They know that usually when someone will not admit to something, it's because there is something to hide. And they have seen where all that shadowy campaign money can take us, to corruption, to scandal, to places like Watergate, dark days where we have been before. And believe me, I don't think the American people want to go back to the era when we had big suitcases of cash and the president was keeping in his White House safe cash. The American people don't want to return there. The Citizens United and Speech Now decision sparked a renewed focus on the need for campaign finance reform. But let's be clear, the court laid the groundwork for this broken system many years ago. In 1976, the court held in Buckley versus Vallejo that restricting independent campaign expenditures violates the First Amendment right to free speech. That ruling established the flawed precedent that money and speech are the same thing. Another nail in the coffin of common sense. And the result? Elections based too much on the ability to raise money and too little on the quality of ideas. Too much on a dedication to fundraising and too little on the public good. Money and free speech are not the same thing. And it is a tortured logic to say they are. They may seem comparable in the rarefied hallways of the Supreme Court, but not in the rough and tumble streets of political campaigns. We know this, and the super PACs writing these huge checks know it too. And they must be chuckling all the way to the bank. But the American people do not find this funny, infuriating perhaps, but definitely not funny. I don't think we can truly fix this broken system until we undo the false premise. The premise that spending money on elections is the same thing as the constitutional right of free speech. That can only be achieved if the court overturns Buckley or we amend the Constitution. Until then, we will fall short of the real reform that is needed. But we still should do all we can in the meantime to make a bad situation better. And that's what we've been trying to do with the Disclose Act. That's what we must do with the Disclose Act. It's not the comprehensive reform that I would like to see, but the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. And the Disclose Act is the good that we can do now. It's a step forward, a vital step forward, even with this flawed Supreme Court precedents that constrain us. The Disclose Act is a step out of the shadows, and that is exactly where we need to be headed. The Disclose Act of 2012 asks a simple question, an important and eminently fair question. Where does the money come from and where is it going? And let me just say, if we don't start asking that question, we may soon be asking another one that we heard when scandal shook this country in years past. What did he know and when did he know it? So a simple question that follows the money, that says the American people have a right to know who is writing the checks. Under the bill, any covered organization, including corporations, labor unions, nonprofit organizations, and super PACs, that spend $10,000 or more on campaign-related disbursements during an election cycle would have to file a report with the Federal Election Commission that discloses all donations above $10,000. It also requires the disclosure of any transfer made to a third party for the purposes of campaign-related expenditures. This addresses the growing problem of using so-called social welfare organizations to funnel anonymous money to super PACs. This is a practical, sensible measure. It doesn't get money out of our elections, but it does shine a light into the dark corners of the campaign finance system. A similar bill in the last Congress had broad support, broad bipartisan support, with 59 votes in the Senate and passing the House. But since then, we have all watched the flood of money raining down during this election year. We are seeing the real impact of Citizens United and Speech Now decisions on our elections. The need for this legislation has become even more apparent. I serve on the Senate Rules Committee, and in March, Chairman Schumer held a hearing on the Disclose Act, and we heard several concerns about the bill, both from our Republican colleagues on the committee and their witness. At the hearing, the minority witness claimed that there were many provisions in the bill that he disliked. And he said, "I think perhaps the most radical is the government-mandated disclaimer." While I disagree with his assertion that standing by your ad is a radical idea, that's no longer an issue in this bill. We've taken it out, the disclaimer provision. I still believe it's an important provision, but we listened to the minority's concerns and revised the bill. Another concern raised at the hearing was the effective date of the legislation. Senator Alexander is our ranking member on the committee, and I think a great deal of him and appreciate the work that he and Chairman Schumer have done on many issues. At the hearing on Disclose, Senator Alexander said the following: "This hearing is as predictable as the spring flowers in the middle of an election. My friends on the other side of the aisle are trying to change the campaign finance laws to discourage contributions from people with whom they disagree, all to take effect on July 1, 2012. Well, guess what, Senator Alexander? We've also addressed this concern. The bill has been changed so that the disclosure requirements go into effect at the beginning of next year. So the shadow groups can still do everything in their power to buy this election. They can still hide their faces from the voters, but they would have to step up to the plate the next time around. They could still write the checks, they could still try to buy future elections, but they would finally have to say who they are at the checkout stand. The bill we are considering is as simple and straightforward as it gets. If you're making large donations to influence an election, the voters in that election should know who you are. And that is not a radical concept. What's really disappointing is that this type of disclosure and campaign finance reform more generally used to have broad bipartisan support. Now that conservative super PACs are raising huge sums of cash and hiding many of their donors, disclosure has suddenly become another partisan issue. If you look at past reform efforts, they have always been bipartisan. In 1972, the Federal Election Campaign Act passed with strong bipartisan support from both parties. After Watergate, Democrats and Republicans came together again to strengthen the act and set limits on independent expenditures. More recently, in 2002, we passed the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, also known as McCain-Feingold. That bill passed in the Senate with broad support. 5 of our current Republican colleagues voted for it. And the constitutional amendment that Senator Bennett and I introduced this Congress, that also used to be bipartisan. Senator Fritz Hollings was the lead sponsor for many years, but the amendment was always bipartisan. It had the support of respected Republican senators like Ted Stevens, Arlen Specter.
The senator has utilized 10 minutes.
John Danforth, Thad Cochran, and John McCain. I would ask the chair for an additional 2 minutes.
Without objection.
So you can see why I'm disappointed with the partisanship that has taken over this important issue. It's not like the problem of money influencing our elections has been solved. The recent Supreme Court decision struck down laws that my Republican colleagues voted for. I hope that they would be willing to work with us now to pass disclosure laws that will withstand judicial scrutiny. And Mr. President, I would ask that my full statement be put in the record as if spoken.
Without objection.
And with that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, thank you. I'd like to thank my neighbor, the senator from New Mexico, for his kind words and his leadership on this issue. I've been privileged to have the chance to co-sponsor a constitutional amendment that would, I think, respond very nicely to the things that he hears from his constituents as I hear from mine, whether Republicans, Democrats, or independent voters. I also want to thank the senator from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse, tonight for organizing this and for his leadership over these many months. It is 8:15 p.m. Tonight in Washington, D.C. as we debate this bill. Actually, we're not debating the bill because we weren't even allowed to move to a debate on the bill. I can't tell you the number of times we haven't been able to do that. I'm often struck by the fact that I think the Founding Fathers would have wanted us to debate all these bills and to vote up or down on each one of these bills and to go home and explain to our constituents why we voted one way or why we voted another way. But here we are, not technically debating a bill once again, because we haven't even been able to move on to a piece of legislation that historically, and I hope again, will become bipartisan. But as I mentioned, Mr. President, it's 8:15 here. At home in Colorado, it's 6:15. It's dinner time in Colorado. Families are sitting around, I hope they are, I know they are, having dinner with their loved ones, much as I did when I was a boy. And I can remember my parents who followed public affairs closely. They'd turn on the evening news every night about this time, and Walter Cronkite would be on the television. And I remember the ads, as you probably do, the senator from New Mexico, were ads for things like Geritol, for things that cleaned your dentures. I remember one ad in particular, every single night it would come on. I never could believe they could get the cherry stains out of those pearls. But every single night, they were able to do it. And if there was a political ad on television, the candidate had to get on that ad at the end and say, my name is Michael Bennet. My name is Jeff Merkley. My name is Tom Udall or Dick Durbin or Harry Reid or Sheldon Whitehouse, and I approve that message. That's what we saw when I was a child. Tonight, families all over my state, which is a swing state in this country, are going to have to endure advertisement after advertisement after advertisement that are not advertising those consumer products I described earlier, but are advocating for candidates and political ideas, and they're all going to have, or many of them will have, phony names. A Committee for a Strong America, or Tall Children, or Strong Teeth, is what they're going to see. But now, because of what the Supreme Court ruling did, they can't even find out if they wanted to who's donated to those fake committees, in many cases. Now, I wanted to start out tonight, Mr. President, by making clear what's not at issue with this bill. This is not a constitutional question that we're debating here tonight. There's not a question that disclosure and disclaimer, which this bill doesn't even do, I'll come back to that, disclosure is constitutional. 8 of 9 Supreme Court justices have said not only that it's constitutional, well, they've said it's constitutional, but some have said that's a desired result. Here is Justice Scalia, quote, requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. For my part, I do not look forward to a society which, thanks to the Supreme Court, campaigns anonymously and even exercises the direct democracy of initiative and referendum hidden from public scrutiny and protected from the accountability of criticism. The accountability of criticism, in the Justice's words. This does not resemble the home of the brave. This does not resemble the home of the brave. It takes courage to put your name on something. It takes courage to stand for something that's unpopular. It doesn't take a lot of courage to let somebody use your money in a way that keeps you completely anonymous and imposes something on families in our states who are trying to make a fundamental American decision to vote in a democracy. That doesn't take courage. That's the point Justice Scalia was making, because Justice Scalia, I believe, thought the Congress would do its job and enact what's constitutional. Require disclosure. Require disclaimer. This issue is one that's been well understood in this country since its founding. Here's Patrick Henry in 1788. The liberties of a people never were, nor ever will be, secure when the transactions of their rulers may be concealed from them. Accountability and transparency. That's what this legislation is about, and it is emphatically constitutional. So if somebody comes and tells you that this is about the Constitution, tell them that 8 of 9 Supreme Court justices have already ruled on this question. They have already ruled that what's in the content of this act is constitutional. Now, what's happening out there as a consequence of a decision that was made by the Supreme Court on the one hand and the failure of the Congress to act in a timely manner on the other hand? Well, these super PACs have come into being. These anonymous folks are able to give money. There's one that owns a casino in Las Vegas. And he's actually given more money to super PACs in 2012 than anybody else in the country. At least that's what my understanding is. But to him, this is chump change. So far, he's given $35 million. He says he's going to give more than that. That's a lot of money to most people. But it's not a lot of money to this guy because he has a net worth of $24.9 billion. So we did some math at home, and what we figured out was that in Colorado, or in America, I guess, in the U.S., the average family's net worth is roughly $77,000. That's their net worth. And so if they were to spend the same percentage of their net worth that this one casino owner in Las Vegas has spent of his net worth, that'd be about $108, which is about what people spend a week on groceries who are making this kind of money. To them, that'd be a little bit of a sacrifice, I guess, $108. But if they knew they could control the outcome of elections in state after state after state, if they could influence the election of the very President of the United States by spending .0001 of their net worth, $108, they might do it. This is pocket change for him. These numbers get so big, it's hard sometimes to think about what it means. That net worth, this one person's net worth, is 332,000 times the net worth of our average family. 332,000 times. Think about it this way, Mr. President, and forget about this for a second. Think about this. The median household income in Colorado is roughly $56,000. That's what it is. It's roughly $56,000. A family earning $56,000 in Colorado every year, year in and year out, who never paid any taxes — they're probably paying a higher rate, by the way, than this guy in Las Vegas — but who never paid any taxes, who never spent one penny of their salary. $56,000 a year, year in and year out, and didn't spend a nickel of it. They would have to do that for 441,000 years before it added up to what this guy has. Just to give you a sense of perspective, human beings made their appearance on this planet 200,000 years ago. Half, less than half, of what it would take for this diligent and prudent family to raise what has been, what this fellow is worth. It gives you a sense of the order of magnitude. And as some of my colleagues have said, one of the things that's really interesting about the super PAC phenomenon is it's a very small group of very wealthy people that are contributing to it. It's not most corporations. It's not most people that have some means. This is a tiny, tiny group of people that are committed to a set of political outcomes in their economic interests that I'm not sure are in the same interests of most of the folks that live in my state. And again, we're not saying they can't do it. This bill doesn't say they can't do it. This bill just says if you're going to do it, you need to tell us who you are. We want to know who you are. Step up and say why it is you're doing what you're doing. It's not surprising, by the way, that this problem has become enormous since this decision was made. In 2006, 1% of donors were undisclosed. That was it. That was it, 1%. 99% were disclosed, 1% was not disclosed. Today, actually, it's even worse today. This is 2010, a year I was running, and a year when Colorado saw more outside money and my ugly mug more on the television than anybody should deserve to see, more outside money than any state in the United States of America. 44% of the money that was spent was not disclosed. The identity of the people that gave the money was not disclosed. That's half, virtually, of what was spent, and it's going to be worse this year. It's not surprising, and everybody who's been a parent would know this intuitively. I have 3 daughters that are 12, 11, and 7, and believe me, there's nothing mysterious about this. Not surprisingly, as the spending has become more anonymous, the advertising has become more negative. If one of my kids thinks they can get away with doing something negative to one of their sisters, which is not often, but it happens, and they think they can get away with it without anybody catching, they're a lot more likely to do it than if they know somebody's watching.
The senator has utilized 10 minutes.
I'd ask for an additional 2 minutes, Mr. President.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so you can see here that the proportion of positive advertising here much, much higher than negative. Today, it's almost entirely negative. And between the hours of 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. tonight in the state of Colorado and across the United States of America, those graphs are going to be borne up by negative ad after negative ad after negative ad. And listen, I'll close with this, Mr. President. I'll close with this. We face enormous structural issues in the economy in this country. And we faced them for a while, and we're facing them again because, as you can see from this chart, GDP growth, our economic output, has decoupled from wage growth and job growth. That's what's happened in the United States, and the job of this Congress, the job of this administration, and our generation's job is to recouple those so that we have a rising middle class in this country. And that's what we should be spending our time on as we think about reforming our tax code and our regulatory code and our statute books. But there are some folks around that aren't necessarily all that interested in that because the current system works pretty well for them. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people say in this chamber that the government shouldn't pick winners and losers. And that's really easy when you're on the winning side to say that. We ought to have a set of rules in this country that are responsive to the needs of the vast majority of American people, whether Republicans, Democrats, Independents, who together, no matter where they are in the economic spectrum, all want essentially the same thing, which is to make sure that we are not the first generation of Americans to leave less opportunity, not more, to the people that are coming after us. I believe that anybody that wants to come to that debate, anybody that wants to play in that game is welcome, but they ought to tell us who they are. And with that, Mr. President, I will yield the floor, and I see the senator from Illinois is here and look forward to his remarks.
Mr. President.
The senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I thank the senator from Colorado for his remarks. They were spot on. Special thanks to my colleague from Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse, for gathering us here this evening. It's almost 8:30 Washington time. Chamber is otherwise empty. A few members, Senator Stabenow of Michigan, preparing to speak. This is not really a Senate debate. That happens almost never in this body, which is unfortunate. I had hoped that perhaps some members from the other side would come and defend their position, but they haven't. It's their right to go home, and they've done it.
we think it's worth a few minutes of our time to come even this late at night to talk about this issue. Mr. President, Lyndon Johnson was a pretty famous senator and president. And he used to say back in the day that when he was looking for advisors, he wishes that he had someone near him who would run for sheriff. What Lyndon was saying, President Johnson was saying, was that the practical experience of politics is somehow a lot different than what many people imagine. I thought of that when I reflected on this Supreme Court currently sitting, the same court that decided Citizens United, and the fact that not one of them has ever stood for election. None of them have gone through a campaign. When they addressed Citizens United, it was strictly from a legalistic academic viewpoint, and the decision reflected it, because it was such a gross departure from where we had been as a nation. A presidential candidate may argue that corporations are people. Our Supreme Court in Citizens United said that the views of corporations should be treated like the views of people, like the free speech that every American is guaranteed under our Constitution. And with that just twist of a phrase, they have literally changed the face of politics in America in a negative fashion. I would say the Citizens United case from the Supreme Court was as negative on the political process of America as the Dred Scott decision by the same Supreme Court was on the social fabric of America. What they have unleashed with Citizens United is a force we have never, ever seen before in American politics. It is the force of anonymous, secret donors, people, oligarchs, millionaires and billionaires who are determined to impose their political will on the body politic and will spend whatever it takes to achieve it. We are seeing it all across the country. There's not a single contested Senate race that these super PACs haven't arrived and spent $5, $10, $12, $15 million already in negative advertising across this country, most of it unaccounted for. Now, the Disclose Act, which brings us together this evening, is very basic in that people who give more than $10,000 must disclose their identity. It applies to labor unions, corporations, everyone. It's across the board. Now, disclosure used to be one of the tenets, one of the pillars of the Republican position. They used to say, don't limit what a person can give as long as they disclose it in a timely fashion. Well, they amended their position after Citizens United and lopped off the end of it. Don't limit what a person can give, period. They don't call for timely disclosure anymore. The Disclose Act does. And why is it important? It's important because Americans have good judgment, and they know that if a person, for example, the Koch brothers of Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken, wherever their home happens to be, they're interested in energy and oil production. And if they invest millions of dollars on behalf of a certain candidate, many people, many voters will say, well, I wonder what that candidate's position is on their issues of the tax treatment of oil companies, on energy tax credits and the like. So Americans will ask the right question as long as they know who's behind the issue. Under Citizens United, there's no compulsion. As Senator Bennett of Colorado said just moments ago, the Supreme Court made it clear in its Citizens United decision that though they were unleashing the opportunity to contribute, that they expected that there would be accountability, like the Disclose Act. Well, unfortunately, they didn't anticipate that it would become a partisan issue, and virtually no Republicans have supported us. Today, when the vote was cast, not a single Republican would vote to bring this bill to the floor for debate. We are now in the midst of a Republican filibuster on the Disclose Act, another Republican filibuster. Not one single Republican senator would join us in this effort to bring this bill to the floor for a debate, amendment, and a vote. We've seen so many Republican filibusters, now we see this one. The reason that this is more important than most is it really gets to the heart of our political process. It isn't just a matter of who spends what and how much in a campaign. I look at it from a little different perspective. I'm concerned about who will run for office. I used to put myself in the category, think it still applies, of mere mortals who decided to get involved in politics. I don't come from wealth. I'm not a wealthy person. I have never relied on my personal wealth to get me elected. If I did, it wouldn't last very long. And I wonder if people like me will ever get engaged in politics after Citizens United. They have to stop and think. No matter how many doors I knock on, no matter how many hands I shake, no matter how often I study the issues and take positions that I think are meaningful and would resonate with voters, the fact is some super PAC could arrive tomorrow, spend $1 million and blow me away. That is a humbling thought for someone deciding to engage in a race for public office for the first time. Now, I think that this really gets to the heart of what's wrong with politics in America, the cost and nature of our political campaigns. It is a fact, and you hear it every day on the floor of the Senate. People measure the gravity and importance of votes in terms of their political impact. How many times have I heard someone cast a vote here and afterwards say, well, that'll be a good 30-second spot? You think about that because you know that's what our life experience translates into. Messages that can be delivered through the media to the voters. And now this outside force comes along and spends enormous amounts of money, dramatically increasing the amount that's been spent. As was said earlier, 2006, outside groups spent $70 million to influence federal midterm elections. 2006, $70 million. 4 years later, super PACs, outside groups, spent $294 million, 4 times as much. Trust me, it's on its way up. Well, what will the average family think about this? I said to my colleagues at a lunch a few weeks back, I think that the average voter looks at this enormous wash of money coming into American politics much the way they view gangland killings. Well, as long as they want to kill one another off, and I don't have to hear the gunfire, and my family's not in danger, then let them have at it. Spend whatever you want, politicians versus politicians. But the fact is, this is going to be gunfire they're going to hear, because the net result of these super PACs and the money they spend will be decisions on critical issues. Trust me, the people who are pouring the money into the super PACs have an agenda. It's an agenda about the role of government, what the tax code will look like, whether certain corporations and special interests will be treated in a better way by the candidates who are benefited by super PACs. So though the average family may think it's just politicians squabbling and wasting their own money, it's much worse. It unfortunately brings us to the point where we have to worry not only about who will run for office, but once elected, who will stay in office. And what about those in office? I've thought about it myself. I'm sure my colleagues have. You cast a vote on the floor, and you think to yourself, I just opened the door for a super PAC to come in the next time I'm up for an election to nail me because I took them on. But if we've reached the point where members of the United States Senate are quaking and quivering over the prospect of super PAC money being spent against them, we're going to lose something very fundamental and important in the American body politic. I also want to say something about those who are defending the secrecy of the super PACs. In my hometown newspaper and in the newspapers of Chicago, after they print an article, they usually give local people a chance to anonymously comment, and occasionally I read the banter back and forth. It is amazing the chest-thumping, fire-breathing that you get in these comments from these anonymous pipsqueaks who don't have the courage to disclose their own names. And I would say that it should be a standard in American politics. If you feel strongly enough to put your money on the line in a super PAC, then you ought to have the courage, and the law should require that your identity be disclosed as well. I see Senator Stabenow is here, and I know that she's got a busy life of her own, and I'm going to yield the floor to her. But I will say one last thing. I was invited to go on The Daily Show, which a lot of people follow closely, and I enjoy every time I watch. And Jon Stewart asked a question of me. If you could pass one law that would change politics for the better in America, what would it be? And I said, well, it may be a little egotistical of me, but it would be a bill I have for public financing of campaigns. I really honestly believe that if we moved to a stage where we had public financing, shorter campaigns, positive messages, real debates, it would enhance not only our reputation with the voters of America, it would enhance the institutions that we're running for. Currently, we don't have that. We don't have public financing. Maybe we never will. But while we have the current system of money being spent, let's at least demand, as the Disclose Act does, that there be transparency and accountability for the good of our democracy and for the benefit of the voters. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Michigan.
Thank you so much. I first want to thank Senator Whitehouse for his leadership. I'm proud to join him and so many of my colleagues in supporting and co-sponsoring the legislation that's in front of us, and thank our majority floor leader for his comments, and all of those who care deeply about, frankly, our democracy, which is really what we're talking about this evening. I strongly believe in the Disclose Act and think it's critical as step one. I think there's frankly much more that needs to be done even as we go forward to add to this. But this is a very important basic standard of transparency. If you spend $10,000 on ads trying to affect an election, people should know who you are. It's just as simple as that. And I think it's important for us to emphasize the fact that a majority of the Senate this evening voted for this bill. The reason we didn't pass the bill tonight is that the Republicans, colleagues on the other side of the aisle, are putting us in a situation where we have to reach 60 votes, and therefore, by not doing that, they are filibustering the bill. So they're blocking the bill. They're filibustering the bill. We have a majority. All we want is a vote. Just give us a vote. If we had an up or down vote on this bill would have been passed. And I think it's incredibly important for everyone to understand that. It's not that we don't have the support. We have the votes. It was demonstrated this evening. At the moment, what we don't have is the supermajority to get past a filibuster. And I would urge everyone listening and watching tonight to contact their member to urge them to support the effort to stop the filibuster, which is what we're talking about right now. Unfortunately for everyone in America, we know this is going to be the most negative campaign cycle in the history of the country. Secretly funded negative ads with ominous music and shadowy figures and vicious attacks are going to fill our living rooms for the months between now and the election. In fact, in many states, that's already been happening very, very intensely. And we know why. We've been talking about that. A court decision that has tied money to free speech. Corporations are people. Money equals free speech, which creates a situation where now we're being told through the Supreme Court ruling on Citizens United that we, in fact, cannot put limits on corporate money or union money or any other kind of dollars coming in because it's under the category of free speech. And it's opened the floodgates for secret money, allowing special interests, and that's who's spending the money, special interests with their own agenda, to spend unlimited funds to essentially buy elections, to buy a U.S. Senate that works for them, a U.S. House of Representatives, a presidency that works for them, not the majority of Americans, not the folks that got up this morning and went to work. Maybe they took a shower before work, but maybe they took a shower after work. The folks that are working very, very hard every day trying to hold it together, who've been through the toughest recession we have seen since the Great Depression, who have most likely struggled with their house underwater and credit card debt too high and tried to piece together maybe 1 or 2 or 3 part-time jobs to hold things together for their families. They're not the ones that are funding these secret ads. It's not their secret money. What we know so far is that over half the money that's come in has been from 17 multi-billionaires in our country. And when you think about that, it's pretty worrisome when you think about the fact that 17 or 18 or 20 people in our country could decide to buy a form of government that works for them. That is certainly not a democracy. And I think that this bill is part of an effort that we are all working to achieve to really protect the basics of our democracy. It's not about making judgments for people about who they should vote for, who they should support, how they should be involved in elections, but it is about making sure that we all know, that the American people know who's spending the money, so that each American can make their own judgment about the agenda of the people that are spending the money and whether or not it reflects their own agenda and their own values. So this is just simply about shining the light of day, opening up a process, transparency, so that each of us can make our own judgments about who we choose to believe and not believe in this political process. You know, when we run TV ads, the law requires us to disclose. We go on at the end of the ad and say, you know, I'm Senator Stabenow and I approve this message. Personally, I don't see why somebody else funding it shouldn't be doing that too, and I know that the sponsor of this bill agrees with that, as do I know my colleagues on this side of the aisle. But we're not even asking that. We're simply saying if you spend $10,000 or more, you need to disclose it. You need to put it up on a website so the public has the opportunity to know who you are and how much you're spending. There's a couple of brothers we talk a lot about now because of the money that they have been openly talking about spending. It's been in the papers, certainly. It's been in the media for months. But two gentlemen called the Koch brothers who have been spending millions and millions of dollars, and I believe, I don't know what the final numbers will be. I've seen numbers that show that each of the two of them say they want to spend $200 million, $400 million together. I don't know, maybe more, to impact the elections. I think it's important for the people in Michigan, the people in Rhode Island, the people in Colorado, across the country, to know that they're doing that and who they are and how much is being spent in order to make a judgment about how they're choosing to spend their money. If someone, whoever it is spending dollars above $10,000 on influencing elections through ads, Americans have a right to know. And we know right now from the way we've been able to piece together so far what is happening, that we are talking about big, wealthy special interests. No surprise as to who's spending the money. What's their motivation? What are they trying to buy? Well, I know that there are those that would like to keep special tax breaks for shipping jobs overseas. We're going to have a chance, once we complete this debate, to vote on legislation of mine called the Bring Jobs Home Act. There are those that don't want us to eliminate the tax break that allows folks who are shipping jobs overseas to write it off their taxes, which I find outrageous. But there are folks on the other side shipping jobs overseas who want to keep that tax break and may very well want to spend money against candidates and against members who vote for my bill. We know that big oil companies want to keep taxpayer subsidies. These, even though they're the most profitable companies in the history of the world, and probably when the tax incentives started in 1916 made a lot of sense for new emerging companies, doesn't make sense today from a taxpayer standpoint to be paying high prices at the pump out of one pocket and subsidies to the companies out of the other. But we know that they may very well want to spend money to be able to keep those subsidies. 73% of Americans want to end oil and gas subsidies, but the special interests are fighting to keep them and spending money, and we know that there's money being spent in the elections, secret money, to support people that will keep those tax subsidies. So the question is, why is this in the public interest in America, in the greatest democracy in the world, Why in the world are we letting this happen? Our democracy is not for sale. It should not be for sale, and we're fighting to make sure that it's not for sale. The people of our country are the ones who have the power to decide who represents them, and it should not be a group of anonymous billionaires somewhere that are able to do that. So when those billionaires want to buy attack ads and influence our votes, the least they can do is have the courage to come forward, say how much they're spending, and put their name to it, and be able to have to disclose that to everybody. The American people have the right to know. The people in Michigan have the right to know. We've seen already millions of dollars being spent in Michigan, and people have the right to know who's spending that money, what's their background, what's their interests, so that they can make their own judgment about whether or not it has any credibility. The 2010 midterm elections saw more than 400% increase in spending from what's been called the super PACs. 400% increase in spending 2 years ago compared
Senator's
to
10 minutes has expired.
2006. If I might just have one more minute without objection.
Without objection.
Thank you.